Number 1. That's a rank for Massachusetts on a number of national education benchmarks, such as SAT, college admissions test, and others. But not every student here is hitting those high marks. Now, more than a dozen advocacy organizations from across the state, including the Urban League of Springfield, have come together to push for an honest, open conversation about achievement gaps among students and its belief more funding is needed to help those students. A new report from the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership points out some of those gaps, largely among African American and Hispanic students who aren't making the same grades as their Asian and white peers. I discussed the report with Henry Thomas, President and CEO of the Urban League of Springfield.
The good news is that unquestionably Massachusetts is number 1 in the country as it relates to academic performance and progress. The celebration of the 25th year of the Massachusetts Education Reform Act is a time to celebrate the number 1 status. However, we can't take a bow and we won't get a standing ovation because there are a number of inequities and disparities that have a direct impact on the students going through the public school system and the communities in which they live, as well as the Massachusetts economy.
Right, yeah, and so let's look at specifically some of the findings of the report. And I want to kind of start young and work older for students. So we'll look at the 3rd grade reading level, and the report points out that 29% of African American and Latino 3rd graders either met or exceeded the expectations for reading level when you look at the MCAS standards. Now that's compared to 65% of Asian and 54% of white students. So quite a large difference there between African American minority students and white students. What did you think when you heard that statistic?
Well, I think that if you look at the overall academic performance throughout the grades, you'll find the same kind of trend line. The challenge is that there are a number of equity gaps and educational gaps that impact performance, and students are expected to perform at a proficient level, and those levels are already established as state standards.
Right, proficient, meeting expectations, et cetera, are the kind of the labels the state uses.
Exactly, and a number. The unfortunate thing is that because of those inequities that do exist, what am I talking about inequities? I'm talking about access to digital.
So kids might not have Wi-Fi in their house, or the library closes early if they're using the
digital
computer there.
Resources, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, and digital resources will facilitate and enhance learning and the speed of learning. And if you don't have that, then you're really behind. And so children who are coming from the low income, or they may describe it as, I think, high poverty areas. In Springfield alone, 40% of the Black and Latino families do not have connection to the internet.
Right, it's expensive.
So, yeah, it's expensive. Although Comcast has an initiative where they provide very inexpensive opportunities for people who fall into free lunch and or reduced costs
Which
for
is one
lunch
way
and
that the
breakfast.
state looks at how many impoverished students they're serving in the district.
Right.
I want to talk about graduation rates too, because the report points this out. You know, statewide, 79% of African American students, 73% of Latino students graduated in 4 years. That's compared to 92% of white students. And then in Springfield, you know, you have 85% of African American students graduated, 72% of Hispanic students, and 82.6% of white students graduated. So some better than the state average, and some worse than the state average. But we've seen some improvements in those graduation rates recently.
Well, Springfield just reported out with the new MCAS scores that were released last week that they've seen some incremental progress, and that's good, and we want to celebrate that. But as the superintendent of schools, Dan Warwick, had indicated, it needs to happen faster, and we wholly concur with that. All roads lead back to expectations. So if you have high expectations, you can get high results.
Who do you think is setting those expectations for these students?
Well, I think, it's interesting question. The expectation is not the standard. The standard is the mark.
You mean the standard meaning the test?
The test and what proficiency is. But the expectation goes to whether you think the student is capable of meeting the mark or, making the proficiency levels, hitting the state standards.
So you mean maybe an adult turning to a student and saying, you can do this? Yeah,
well, I think that would be the proactive thing, is not to just tell them that they can do it, but provide the kind of supports and invest in the money that is available to most of the gateway cities, Springfield being a gateway city, is not substantial enough to handle the challenges that are embedded within the school systems. And so more resources. It's not just a money problem, though, but it's also the community has to have a high expectation that students, where they embrace the idea that all students are capable of learning at high levels.
So let's look at that community expectation first. Urban League of Springfield is working with the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership. That's a tough name for me. Right. Really representing Western Massachusetts and working on this problem. How are you speaking about how to set those expectations for students?
Well, two ways. One, we have an advocacy role. By sitting on these commissions and initiatives and boards, it gives us a voice to leverage, a point of view that will be helpful. One example is that 80% of the students who graduate and go to college in the Black community and the Latino community go to non-selective schools, which means like community colleges and state colleges. 64% of those students, of the 80% that go to those colleges, 64% of them need remediation once they get there.
Meaning they need a little help catching up.
They need a little help, sometimes a lot of help. It takes them a year, maybe a year and a half to catch up, but they're paying for those remedial courses and using their Pell money, and they run out of money, and therefore you have such a low finish rate. So we sit on state boards. I serve on the board of higher education. I'm the past chair of the UMass Board of Trustees, and so my voice is important to make the serious point and the urgency of the point that we can do better, and we need to find ways to do better.
Because that's a really, I think, important thing to point out to people. There's a lot of discussion in the community about how important it is to graduate from high school and increasing that rate, and we celebrate it. It's a good thing. But to your point, if kids are graduating and they're not ready to go to school, it's costing them more.
Failed them.
Yeah.
You failed them. And every child in Massachusetts has a constitutional right to expect a high quality, effective education. And that's the promise that we make to all children who go to Massachusetts public schools. And if they don't receive that quality education, then we are breaching that particular promise. It's important that young people develop the confidence, that parents have the confidence and belief that all of their children can achieve at high levels, but the school system can't do it by itself, and that's where an Urban League and other agencies and organizations come in. And we should be not only advocating, but we should also find ways to support school systems.